Hello, everyone. I don't know how to begin this. This isn't an easy thing for me to share, but something inside me is telling me I have to. It's the kind of thing that haunts you, that keeps you awake at night, when the shadows seem a little too long and the silence feels wrong. A couple of months ago, I received an email from one of you, a listener who had shared their own terrifying experience. You asked if I had ever experienced something so real, so visceral, that it made you question your very perception of reality. I've been avoiding this, but after everything that happened to me in that small rural town last December, I can't keep it to myself anymore. Maybe telling this will help me make sense of it. Or maybe it'll just make it worse. I was in the middle of nowhere. That's how I remember it. The endless stretch of land, bare and unforgiving, with only a few scattered farmhouses on the horizon. I'd been driving through this part of the country for hours, trying to make my way to a small cabin I'd rented out for a weekend alone. It was supposed to be peaceful, a break from the chaos of everyday life. Just me, a book, and some time to clear my head. It was the kind of town that you wouldn't find on most maps, the kind of place where people still lived by the old ways. The roads were winding, narrow, and barely paved. As I drove deeper into the countryside, the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the barren fields. It felt like the kind of place where time slowed down, and maybe that should have been my first warning. I had planned for this trip. I had read about the area's history, how it was rich with old stories and ghostly legends, but I didn't really believe in them. At least, I didn't want to believe in them. I brushed off the warnings, convinced that it was just the stuff of folklore. But then I pulled into the little town, a few houses lined up along the dusty street, dim lights flickering in the windows. The air felt colder than it should have been for December. A shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't just the temperature, though. There was something else I couldn't place. I stopped at a small diner on the edge of town to grab some coffee. The place was nearly empty, save for an older man hunched over a cup at the counter. The waitress, a woman in her late 40s, greeted me with a smile, though it was a little too quick, like she had already sized me up and decided I wasn't a threat. "You'll be wanting the cabin up on Hilltop, won't you?" she asked, her voice raspy, as if she'd been talking to herself for far too long. I nodded, surprised. I hadn't mentioned where I was staying. "That place has a history," she added quietly, lowering her voice. Her eyes darted around, checking to see if anyone else was listening. I tried to brush it off, thinking it was just another one of those local superstitions. "Just make sure you lock up tight," she continued, "and if you hear anything, don't go outside." Her warning struck me as odd, but I didn't ask any further. I paid for my coffee, nodded to the man at the counter, and left the diner. I was ready to get to the cabin, ready for solitude, but something about that woman's words stuck with me as I climbed back into my car and drove toward the hilltop. The sun was just setting when I arrived. The cabin was perched at the top of a small hill, isolated, with nothing but trees and the growing darkness surrounding it. As I got out of my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The wind howled, but the trees remained eerily still, their limbs outstretched like fingers clawing at the sky. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. It had the smell of pine wood, a warmth that should have been comforting, but in that silence, it only felt empty. The furniture was old, worn, but functional. I settled in, made myself a small dinner, and tried to push away the nagging feeling in my gut. I should have known better. That night, after the last rays of sunlight disappeared, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint creaks of the wood. The silence pressed in on me, heavier than it had any right to be. I tried to sleep, but it wasn't long before I heard it, a knock. It was quiet at first, just a soft rap, but then it came again, louder this time, like someone was knocking on the door. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to reason with myself, it's probably just the wind, maybe it's an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The knocks came again, and this time, I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed the flashlight from the bedside table, my hands shaking, and crept toward the door. But when I looked outside, there was no one there. I stood there, flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through the thick darkness. But there was nothing. Just the vast expanse of trees stretching into the night, their branches swaying ever so slightly in the wind. The chill in the air had deepened, sending a cold shiver up my spine. It felt as though the night itself was closing in around me. I told myself I had imagined it, that I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was out there, watching me. I turned away from the door, closing it gently, as if the very act of doing so would somehow make the fear go away. I went back to bed, trying to steady my breathing, but it wasn't long before the sounds started again. First, it was the knocking. Soft at first, like a distant tap on wood. It wasn't coming from the door anymore, it was coming from the window. I froze. The thought of looking outside, of seeing what was out there, terrified me. But I had to. Something inside me urged me to turn the curtain aside, to look. I was no longer sure what was real and what wasn't. I slowly stood up, the floorboards creaking under my weight as I approached the window. My heart pounded in my ears. The knocking continued, more insistent now, like a steady rhythm, punctuated by a soft scraping sound like fingernails running along glass. When I parted the curtains and shone the flashlight out into the dark, the beam flickered in and out, as if it couldn't decide what it was supposed to illuminate. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something, a shape, moving just beyond the reach of the light. It was quick, like a shadow darting between the trees. But when I turned the flashlight toward it, there was nothing. Just the wind, I told myself again. But I knew it wasn't the wind. I stepped away from the window, trying to calm myself. My hands were trembling so badly that I almost dropped the flashlight. That's when I noticed something on the floor next to the door. It was small at first, but as I knelt down, I realized what it was: footprints. Muddy prints, like someone had stepped through the wet ground just outside. But the ground around the cabin was frozen solid. There had been no rain, no mud. And yet, the prints were there, leading from the door to the window, then disappearing back into the night. That was when it hit me I wasn't alone. I backed away from the door, my mind racing, heart pounding. The cabin felt like it was closing in on me, the walls pressing in with every breath I took. The silence was unbearable now, and the only sound that filled my ears was my own shallow breathing. I looked around the room, desperately searching for something, anything, to explain what was happening. Then, I heard it again, the soft scraping sound. It was closer now. My breath hitched in my throat, and I turned, wide-eyed, toward the source of the sound. The shadow at the edge of the room just outside the reach of the light was moving again. This time, I couldn't ignore it. I saw it clearly. A figure, a shape darker than the night itself, standing motionless in the far corner of the room. I couldn't see details, just the form, but I knew, somehow, that it was watching me. And then it moved. Faster than I could react, it crossed the room in a blink, coming toward me with a speed that should have been impossible for anything human. My mind screamed to run, but my legs felt frozen in place. I could feel its presence, feel it breathing just behind me, a chill seeping into my skin. I dared not turn around to face it, but I could hear its slow, deliberate footsteps, like it was savoring my fear. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. I stood there, paralyzed. I couldn't hear anything now. The footsteps had stopped. The air was thick, suffocating. And then I felt it. A hand, cold, clammy, brushed against my back, sending a shock of ice through my body. My mind screamed at me to move, but my body refused to obey. I could feel the fingers tighten, and I finally managed to spin around, hoping for something, anything, to explain the touch. But there was nothing there, nothing but the suffocating darkness. I backed up, slamming into the wall behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart racing. I fumbled for the flashlight, and when I turned it on, the beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty, silent room. I didn't know what to do. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to leave, but another part, the part that had somehow known from the moment I arrived, that something was wrong kept me rooted in place, too terrified to make a move. And then, from the deepest corner of the cabin, a voice. It was soft at first, a whisper that crawled along my spine like a cold wind. "Leave now, before it's too late." The voice, cold, hollow, sounded like it came from all around me, from the very walls of the cabin. I froze, my blood running cold, the flashlight trembling in my hand as I swung it in every direction, desperate to find the source. The room was empty, the same as it had been before. But the voice didn't stop. It grew louder, more insistent. "Leave, before it's too late." I felt the words echo in my mind, vibrating through every inch of my body. There was no mistaking it now, whatever it was. It knew me. It knew I was there, and it wanted me gone. For a split second, my feet moved on their own. I backed away from the corner, eyes darting across the room, searching for anything that could help me. The door was only a few steps away, but I felt like if I turned my back to that dark corner, I'd never make it. The air in the room grew thick, oppressive, like something was pressing in from every side. My chest tightened with every breath I tried to take, and my heart hammered against my ribs. I looked around, my eyes wildly searching the cabin, and then I saw a shadow. Not just any shadow, but one that seemed to belong to the corner, as though it had always been there, waiting. I should have screamed, should have run, but I couldn't. My legs felt like they were locked in place, as if the very ground beneath me had claimed me, holding me in place. The shadow moved, slithering across the floor with a fluidity that defied logic. It was darker than any shadow I had ever seen before, like it absorbed all the light around it. It came closer, and then I heard it again, the scraping sound. That terrible, nauseating sound of nails against the wooden floor. Closer. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered and died, plunging me back into pitch-black darkness. My heart skipped a beat, and I gasped, fumbling for the batteries. But before I could replace them, the room seemed to vibrate, the walls themselves trembling, as if the entire house was alive, breathing. The whispering grew louder. "Leave!" This time, I wasn't sure if the voice was inside my head or if it was real. But then, I felt something brush against my cheek, a cold, wet breath, like a gust of wind that wasn't supposed to be there. I snapped my head to the side, but there was no one there. I could hear it now, the sound of footsteps again, but they weren't coming from the corner. No, these footsteps were coming from behind me. I spun around, but again there was nothing. Just my imagination, I told myself, but my shaking hands told me otherwise. It was all too real. I couldn't stay here any longer. I had to get out. With trembling hands, I shoved the batteries back into the flashlight and flicked it on. The beam of light shot through the darkness, revealing nothing but the worn furniture and the empty, suffocating room. But I could still feel the presence of something watching me. I could feel the weight of its gaze on my every move. My breath hitched as I heard the sound again, louder this time. The scrape of nails against wood. It wasn't far now, not far at all. I had to move. I stumbled toward the door, my legs unsteady, my mind screaming at me to run. But as I reached for the handle, something stopped me. A cold hand, so cold, it burned, gripped my wrist, pulling me back, dragging me into the darkness. I twisted and fought, but the grip was like iron, unyielding. I gasped for air as the pressure on my wrist increased, and then a voice whispered, so close to my ear that it felt like my very soul was being ripped apart. "You can't leave." The words sliced through my mind like a blade, and for the first time since I arrived, I felt an overwhelming terror that rooted me in place. The hand on my wrist tightened further, and I turned to face the presence, knowing I couldn't escape. The shadow in the corner had moved again, now looming just in front of me. It was no longer just a shadow, it had form. A tall, thin figure, its body a collection of shifting darkness that seemed to defy all logic. It had no face, just a void where one should be, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing into my soul. It stepped closer, and my vision blurred, as though the very air around me had thickened, becoming almost solid. I felt nauseous, like I was suffocating, in the presence of something ancient, something that had been here long before me. The whispering returned, louder this time, filling the space with a deafening presence. "You belong here now." I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I struggled against the invisible force, my mind racing for an escape, but my body refused to obey. I was trapped. In the corner of my eye, I saw movement. The figure, or what I could only call it, extended a long, gnarled hand toward me. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though savoring the moment. I could feel the cold radiating from its fingers, creeping up my arm as it reached for me. This was it. This was how I was going to die. And just when I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, the door behind me slammed open with a force so violent that it knocked me off my feet. The room went dark again, and the grip on my wrist disappeared as suddenly as it had come. I was free, but not for long. I pushed myself up, gasping for breath, and scrambled toward the door. The cabinet felt alive with malice, a weight I couldn't shake, pressing down on me with every step. I didn't look back, couldn't look back. I just ran. I don't know how I made it to the door. My legs were weak, my body trembling so violently I felt like I was moving through water, slow and sluggish. But somehow, I found the strength to yank the door open and stumble outside into the cold, bitter air. The wind hit me like a slap in the face, biting through my clothes, but I didn't care. I didn't even stop to close the door behind me. My feet barely touched the ground as I sprinted away from the cabin, heart pounding in my ears, mind spiraling. I had no clear direction, no idea where I was going, and the instinct to escape. The trees loomed around me like dark sentinels, their twisted branches swaying in the wind, whispering things I couldn't hear. The moon was barely visible, hidden behind thick clouds that only let slivers of light slip through. But I didn't need the light to see. I could feel it, the presence, the weight of something chasing me. It wasn't behind me, not yet, but I knew it was coming. My breath came in ragged gasps as I ran, my shoes slipping in the icy dirt, the cold seeping into my bones. I had no plan, no escape route in mind, just the primal need to outrun whatever had decided that I didn't belong. But as I ran, the feeling grew stronger, the unmistakable sensation that something was drawing nearer, watching me. It was in the air, like the forest itself had turned on me, and I was no longer just a person running through the woods. I was prey. I dared a quick glance over my shoulder, but the darkness swallowed everything behind me. There was nothing, and yet I knew it was there. The wind picked up, howling through the trees like a chorus of voices. They were getting louder now, these whispers, almost like they were speaking in my ear, trying to drown out my thoughts. "You can't run." It was the same voice I had heard in the cabin, but this time it felt closer. It felt as though the voice was in my head, scratching at my thoughts, making me question everything. I stumbled again, barely catching myself before hitting the ground. The cold air burned my lungs as I gasped for breath, my feet dragging through the frost-covered earth. My mind raced, trying to figure out what I could possibly do. And then I heard it. A scream, not from behind me, but from somewhere deeper in the woods, somewhere ahead. It was a long, drawn-out cry, full of anguish and despair, like the sound of someone lost in agony. I froze. The scream echoed in my mind, ringing in my ears. It sounded human, but twisted. It sounded like someone who had been in that forest far too long, someone who had become part of it. I didn't stop to think. I didn't care anymore. All that mattered was getting away from whatever was in those woods. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like hands trying to pull me back. I pushed through, ignoring the sharp branches that scratched at my skin. And then, in the distance, I saw it. A flicker of light, just a glimmer, but enough to make my heart leap with hope. I ran toward it, every muscle in my body screaming in protest, every breath burning my chest. The light was growing brighter, and with every step, the whispering voices grew louder, their words becoming more frantic. "Leave! Get out of here!" But it was too late for that now. I was already so deep in the woods, so far from the cabin, that I knew turning back wasn't an option. I reached the light, Finally, and my heart sank. It wasn't a person. The lantern's light illuminated a small clearing, and in the center of that clearing, standing eerily still, was a figure. It was a man, or at least, it looked like one. His back was to me, his head lowered, like he was studying the ground. He wore old, weathered clothes, a dark coat that hung loosely from his shoulders. His hair, long and matted, fell in front of his face, hiding his features. I should have kept running. I should have kept going, but something held me there, like an invisible force keeping me rooted in place. The lantern swayed again, casting strange shadows on the ground. The figure's body jerked, as if it was responding to some invisible signal. Then it moved. The figure turned slowly, deliberately, until it faced me. The man's face, or what I could see of it, was pale, nearly translucent, like the skin had been stretched too tightly over his bones. His eyes, hollow and sunken, stared at me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. But it wasn't his eyes that made my stomach churn. It was his mouth. His lips were pulled back into a grotesque grin, wide and unnatural, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too jagged. His face twisted into something wrong. And then he spoke. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was low, almost a growl, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't know what he meant. I didn't care. All I knew was that I had to get away. I had to run. But the figure didn't move. He stood there, smiling, as if he were waiting for something, waiting for me to make the first move. And then, suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted. The earth trembled, and I stumbled backward, my heart racing as the whispers grew louder, the voices blending into one cacophony of terror. The trees around me seemed to come alive, their limbs twisting and groaning as if they were reaching for me. The figure raised his hand, and for a brief, horrifying second, I thought he was beckoning me toward him. But that's when I heard it, the screeching, violent sound of the wind picking up. A loud crack echoed through the clearing, and the man's face shifted, morphing into something even more grotesque, an expression of pure malice. His eyes narrowed, and his lips twisted into a snarl. The trees around me cracked and snapped, as if the forest itself was coming alive to stop me from escaping. The wind howled like a beast, tearing through the trees, its sound now a deafening roar that drowned out everything else. The lantern's light flickered, casting strange, elongated shadows across the clearing, distorting everything it touched, and the figure-eighth thing stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for something. Waiting for me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. My legs were frozen in place, and my entire body was screaming for me to move, but I was paralyzed, unable to tear my eyes away from the unnatural thing standing in front of me. The figure's lips parted again, and the words that came from his mouth were not words at all. They were a guttural growl, something that sounded like a language not meant for human ears. The earth beneath my feet trembled once more, and the trees around me creaked and groaned, their trunks twisting as if they were alive, as if they were reaching for me, just like the figure was. Suddenly, I understood. This place wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just cursed. It was alive. Alive with something ancient, something that had never fully gone away, something that had been waiting. The air around me thickened. The darkness seemed to close in tighter, pushing in from all sides, and I felt it, the weight of it, pressing down on me, suffocating me. I could feel my heartbeat, loud and fast in my chest, like a warning. But the figure just stood there, still grinning, waiting. Then, without warning, it moved. It was so fast, faster than anything human, and before I could react, it was right in front of me. The thing's face was mere inches from mine now, its grin grotesque, its breath cold as it exhaled over my skin. I could smell the rot in the air, like something dead. "You don't belong here," it hissed. Its voice was no longer just the whisper of a man, it was something far older, something that had lived in the very bones of the land for centuries. "You should never have come." I felt something dark, something cold, deep inside me as the words echoed through my skull. It wasn't just the figure's voice that scared me, it was what I saw in its eyes. a void, an emptiness, like staring into the abyss of time itself. Without thinking, I forced myself to move. My legs felt like lead, but I pushed myself to run, to get away from it, from whatever it was that had its claws in this land. I ran in the direction I thought was the clearing's edge, the trees blurring around me, my breath ragged and panicked. The forest seemed to shift, to move with me, its branches reaching down like twisted hands trying to pull me back. The earth beneath me cracked and groaned, and the whispers grew louder, swirling around me in a maddening cacophony. They were no longer just voices. They were feelings, emotions, sensations, fear, regret, anger, all of them melding into one overwhelming presence, like the forest itself had a soul. I didn't dare to look back. I couldn't, but I could feel it. The figure was still there, still watching me, still following me. Every time I thought I was escaping, the darkness around me deepened, and the trees seemed to close in again. And then, as if my body had given up, I stumbled. My foot caught on a root, and I fell forward, crashing to the ground. My hands scraped against the dirt, my body hitting the cold earth with a sickening thud. I gasped for air, every breath feeling heavier, harder to take. And that's when I heard it. A sound coming from just behind me. The sound of footsteps. I turned slowly, afraid of what I would see, but I couldn't help it. I had to know. The figure stood at the edge of the clearing, standing still once more, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It had stopped, just out of reach, but I knew it wasn't giving up. It was waiting. "Run, then." The figure spoke again, its voice both distant and near at the same time. "But you can't escape." I struggled to my feet, the ground beneath me uneven, and I took off again, running faster, ignoring the pain in my legs, ignoring everything except the sound of my heartbeat and the blood pounding in my ears. I don't know how long I ran. Time seemed to stretch, to warp, like I was running through some kind of nightmare where the rules no longer applied. But eventually, after what felt like an eternity, I broke free from the trees. The landscape opened up, and I saw it, the road, the long, winding road that led back to civilization. The wind had stopped. The forest was silent, but I knew it wasn't over. I didn't stop running until I reached the road. I didn't even look back as I crossed the threshold, leaving the woods behind. When I finally collapsed into my car, I locked the doors, trembling uncontrollably. I was safe. I was out. But I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in those woods, whatever I had encountered, was still there waiting, watching. And that's when I got the second email. It was a short message, just a few lines, and the sender's name was one I didn't recognize. "I saw you. I know you. You didn't leave. You never left." I checked the timestamp. It was sent just minutes before I had gotten into my car. I never went back to that cabin. I couldn't. But every time I close my eyes, I feel it, that presence, that thing, and I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, waiting for me to return. "Hey everyone," I began, my voice steady despite the eerie feeling I always got when retelling these stories. Today's tale comes from an email I received last month. It's a chilling account of a night gone terribly wrong, centered around an old bridge in the middle of nowhere. I paused, letting the weight of the words settle. What makes this story even creepier is that it takes place in December, in the heart of rural America, during one of the coldest winters in recent memory. Let's dive in. The email was from a woman named Linda, who said she'd grown up in a tiny Midwestern town surrounded by endless fields and dense woods, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and secrets rarely stayed hidden for long except for one: the legend of the Red Hollow Bridge. According to the locals, the bridge had been abandoned for decades. It spanned a narrow, sluggish creek, the kind that barely moved in the summer and froze solid in the winter. No one knew exactly why it was built in the first place. The road it connected had long since fallen into disuse, but what made the bridge infamous wasn't its age or isolation, it was the stories. Linda explained that everyone in town grew up hearing the warnings. Never cross the bridge after dark. Some said it was haunted by a woman who had drowned in the creek below. Others believed it was cursed, that anyone who lingered too long on it would hear strange whispers or even see shadowy figures. Most dismissed it as just a story to scare kids. Linda admitted she never believed iTunes till the night she decided to test the legend herself. It was December, and a heavy snowstorm had just blanketed the area. Linda was home from college for winter break, catching up with her childhood friends. They'd spent the evening drinking hot cocoa and swapping old ghost stories, laughing about how they used to scare themselves silly with tales of the Red Hollow Bridge. That's when her friend Nate suggested they go there. "Come on," he said, his grin mischievous. "We're adults now. Let's prove once and for all that it's just a stupid story." The group hesitated. Even as they laughed at Nate's bravado, there was an unspoken tension in the room. But eventually, curiosity won out. They bundled up, grabbed flashlights, and piled into Nate's truck, heading out into the frozen countryside. The drive was uneventful at first. The snow-covered fields stretched endlessly on either side, the truck's headlights cutting through the darkness. Linda said the mood in the cab was light, filled with jokes and nervous laughter. But as they turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to the bridge, the atmosphere shifted. The trees closed in on either side, their bare branches reaching overhead like skeletal hands. The truck's tires crunched loudly on the frozen ground, the sound echoing in the otherwise silent night. Linda noticed her breath fogging up the window, and for the first time, she felt a twinge of unease. They arrived at the bridge just before midnight. The structure was smaller than Linda remembered, a simple, rusted iron frame barely wide enough for the truck. The creek below was frozen solid, its surface glinting faintly in the moonlight. Nate parked the truck a few feet from the bridge, and the group climbed out, their boots crunching on the icy ground. "Well, here we are," Nate said, his voice loud in the stillness. He shone his flashlight across the bridge, the beam catching the jagged edges of the rusted metal. "Doesn't look so scary to me." Linda forced a laugh, but something about the scene unsettled her. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, and the silence was so deep it seemed unnatural. Still, she followed Nate and the others onto the bridge, their breath clouding in the frigid air. At first, nothing happened. They stood in the middle of the bridge, joking and snapping pictures with their phones. The tension began to ease, and Linda felt herself relax. But then, just as Nate leaned over the edge to shine his flashlight on the frozen creek below, she heard it. A whisper. It was faint, almost indistinguishable from the wind, but it was there, a soft, breathy sound that sent a chill down her spine. She turned sharply, scanning the darkness behind them, but saw nothing. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The others paused, their laughter dying away. "Hear what?" Nate asked, straightening up. Linda hesitated. "I don't know. It sounded like someone whispering." The group exchanged uneasy glances. Nate shrugged, trying to brush it off. "It's probably just the wind. Don't freak yourself out." But Linda couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The whispers grew louder as they lingered on the bridge, an indistinct murmur that seemed to come from all directions. Linda's heart pounded as she scanned the shadows, her flashlight flickering erratically. And then, the temperature dropped. Linda said it felt like all the warmth had been sucked out of the air. The cold was bone deep, sharper than anything she'd felt before, and her breath hung thick and heavy in front of her. One by one, the others noticed it too. "Okay, this is weird," Nate admitted, his bravado faltering. The whispers turned into a low hum, almost like a voice trying to form words. Linda's stomach churned as she realized it wasn't just one voice, it was many, layered on top of each other, overlapping, all speaking at once. And then they stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on them like a physical weight. Linda felt her pulse hammering in her ears as she strained to hear anything. That's when the figure appeared. It was at the far end of the bridge, standing perfectly still, a tall, shadowy silhouette, its features obscured in the darkness. Linda's flashlight flickered again, the beam cutting through the gloom, but it revealed nothing. The figure didn't move. "Who's there?" Nate called out, his voice shaking slightly. There was no answer. The figure remained motionless, but something about it felt wrong. Its shape seemed to shift, subtly, as though it were made of smoke. Linda's breath caught in her throat as the whispers returned, louder this time, building into a crescendo that made her ears ring. "We need to go," she said, her voice trembling. "Now." But before anyone could move, the figure took a step forward. The figure's step was slow and deliberate, yet the sound it made was wrong. It wasn't the crunch of boots on frozen ground, or the metallic clang of feet on rusted iron. Instead, it was a wet, sloshing sound, like someone wading through shallow water, except there was no water beneath the bridge. Linda froze, unable to take her eyes off the silhouette. It moved again, closer this time, and her flashlight, which had been stuttering in and out, gave one final flicker before dying entirely. "What the hell is that?" Nate hissed, his bravado completely gone. No one answered. Linda could hear their panicked breaths, could feel the tension in the air as they all stood rooted to the spot. The whispers around them had grown louder, more distinct, and now Linda could almost make out words. "Leave. Turn back. This is ours." The figure stepped closer still, its form rippling as though it were being distorted by heat waves. Linda's instincts screamed at her to run, but her body wouldn't obey. Her legs felt like they were encased in ice, locked in place. Suddenly, one of her friends, Sarah, let out a choked sob and bolted back toward the truck. Her footsteps pounded against the iron bridge, and the sound seemed to break the spell. "Go!" Linda shouted, finally finding her voice. The group scrambled after Sarah, their movements clumsy and frantic as they fled the bridge. Linda glanced back once, and what she saw made her blood run cold. The figure wasn't following them. It was gliding. Its feet, or whatever passed for feet, weren't touching the ground. It moved smoothly, effortlessly, its dark form almost translucent now, as though it were dissolving into the very air around it. Linda's heart slammed against her ribs as she ran faster, the cold air burning her lungs. Behind her, the whispers grew louder, overlapping into an unintelligible roar that seemed to chase them off the bridge. When they reached the truck, Sarah was already inside, fumbling with the lock on the passenger door. Nate yanked the driver's door open and threw himself in, starting the engine with shaking hands. "Get in!" he shouted, his voice cracking. Linda and the others piled into the back seat, slamming the door shut just as the headlights illuminated the bridge. The figure was still there, standing in the exact center of the bridge, perfectly still. Its head tilted slightly, as if watching them, and then it raised an arm. It wasn't a wave. It was a beckoning gesture, slow and deliberate, its hand curling as though inviting them to return. "Drive," Linda whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. Nate didn't need to be told twice. The truck's tires spun on the icy road before catching traction, and they sped away, the bridge vanishing into the darkness behind them. The drive back to town was silent, except for the sound of their labored breathing. No one spoke, not even Nate, who kept glancing nervously in the rearview mirror, as though expecting the figure to appear behind them. When they finally reached Linda's house, they all sat in the truck for several minutes, too shaken to move. It was Sarah who broke the silence. What was that thing?" she asked, her voice trembling. No one answered. Linda felt her phone vibrate in her pocket and pulled it out with numb fingers. She'd forgotten she'd taken a picture earlier, just before the whispers had started. Opening the gallery, she scrolled to the last photo, her breath caught in her throat. The picture showed the bridge, just as she'd seen it through her flashlight's beam. But there, standing at the far end, was the figure. Its features were still indistinct, its body shadowy and warped, but its eyes were glowing, a faint, unnatural red, like embers in a dying fire. "We shouldn't have gone there," Linda whispered, clutching the phone tightly. Nate turned to her, his face pale. "What do we do now?" Linda didn't answer. She didn't know. For the next few days, Linda couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She tried to go about her holiday break as usual, but every time she closed her eyes, She saw the figure standing on the bridge, its glowing eyes staring straight into hers. And then the nightmares started. They were always the same. She was back on the bridge, alone this time, with the whispers growing louder and louder until they were deafening. The figure would appear closer than before, its shape more defined, its outstretched hand reaching for her. Each time, she woke up drenched in sweat, her heart pounding. But it wasn't just the dreams. Strange things began happening around the house. Doors creaked open on their own. The TV turned on and off at random. One night, while brushing her teeth, she glanced in the mirror and thought she saw a shadow move behind her, though when she turned, there was nothing there. Linda's breaking point came when she received a text message. It was from an unknown number, and it contained only 3 words: "Come back, alone." Linda stared at the text, her stomach twisting into knots. The words, "Come back, alone," pulsed on her screen like a malevolent command. She tried to dismiss it as a prank, maybe one of her friends messing with her, but the thought didn't bring her any comfort. Her hands trembled as she typed back, "Who is this?" There was no response. She blocked the number, hoping that would be the end of it, but deep down, she knew better. Whatever had happened on the bridge that night hadn't stayed there. The next morning, Linda confided in her friend Sarah. They met at a coffee shop in town, far from the isolation of the bridge. Sarah looked just as rattled as Linda felt, her hands wrapped tightly around her mug of steaming tea. "I've been having nightmares too," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "And weird things keep happening at home. Last night I heard something outside my window, like someone whispering my name." Linda's stomach sank. "Do you think it followed us?" Sarah hesitated, her eyes darting toward the window as if expecting to see the figure standing outside. "I don't know, but it doesn't feel like it's over." They sat in uneasy silence for a while, neither of them wanting to voice their growing fear. Finally, Sarah broke the quiet. "Maybe we should go back." Linda's head snapped up. "Are you crazy? Why would we do that?" "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice rising in frustration. "But maybe if we go back, we can, I don't know, undo whatever we did. Maybe it just wants us to acknowledge it." Linda shook her head vehemently. "No way. I'm not setting foot near that place again." But the bridge had other plans. That night, Linda woke to the sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand. Groggy and annoyed, she reached for it, only to feel her heart drop when she saw the screen. It was another message from the same unknown number. "Time is running out." Her blood ran cold. She blocked the number again and threw the phone across the room, her breathing shallow and rapid. The whispers started immediately after. They weren't loud, but they were unmistakably a faint, disembodied murmur that seemed to seep out of the walls themselves. Linda covered her ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside her head now, growing louder, clearer. "Come back, come back, come back." And then, as suddenly as they started, the whispers stopped. Linda sat in the darkness, trembling, too afraid to move. She didn't sleep the rest of the night. By the following evening, Linda felt like she was losing her mind. The whispers returned sporadically, always accompanied by a sharp drop in temperature and the faint smell of rust and decay. Objects in her room moved on their own. A picture frame fell off her desk. Her closet door creaked open without reason. It became impossible to ignore the pull of the bridge. She called Nate, hoping to convince him to go back with her, but when he picked up, his voice was shaky and strained. "Linda, I've been hearing it too." Her chest tightened. "What do you mean?" "The whispers, the shadows. Last night, I saw something." He paused, his breathing uneven. "It was standing at the end of my driveway." Linda's skin prickled. "Nate, we have to do something. We can't just let this keep happening." There was a long silence on the other end. "We have to go back," he said finally, his voice heavy with dread. The next night, Linda, Nate, and Sarah met at the edge of the old dirt road. None of them wanted to be there, but the unspoken understanding was clear. They had no choice. Whatever they had awakened wasn't going to stop until they faced it. The snow had stopped falling, but the air was bitterly cold. Their flashlights cut through the darkness as they trudged toward the bridge, their breath fogging in the icy air. The forest around them was unnervingly silent, as though the entire world were holding its breath. When they reached the bridge, Linda's stomach churned. It looked the same as before, rusted, ancient, and ominously still. But something about the air felt heavier now, thicker, as though they were walking into a trap. "What now?" Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Nate stepped forward, his flashlight beam sweeping across the bridge. "We call out to it. We acknowledge it." Linda hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But then she heard the faint whispering, growing louder with each passing second. The figure appeared again, standing in the same spot as before, its glowing red eyes pierced through the darkness, locking onto Linda with an intensity that made her knees buckle. "You came back," the whispers hissed, their voices layered and inhuman. The air around them turned icy, and Linda felt a pressure in her chest, as though the figure's gaze alone was crushing her. She wanted to run, but her feet wouldn't move. Nate stepped forward, his voice trembling. "What do you want from us?" The figure tilted its head, its shadowy form rippling like smoke. The whispers grew louder, more distinct. "To remember, to suffer, to stay." The last word hit Linda like a physical blow, and she stumbled backward, gasping for air. She could feel it now, an overwhelming sense of despair, of anger and pain emanating from the figure. It wasn't just a ghost. It was something darker. "We're sorry," Sarah cried, tears streaming down her face. "We didn't mean to disturb you." The figure raised its arm again, pointing directly at Linda. The whispers became deafening, a chaotic roar that made her ears ring. "You will stay." And then the ground beneath them cracked. The sound of the ground cracking was like ice splitting apart under unbearable weight. Linda staggered, her arms flailing as the bridge beneath them trembled violently. "Run!" Nate screamed, but the command was swallowed by the deafening roar of whispers and groaning metal. Linda's legs finally obeyed her brain's desperate commands, and she sprinted toward the truck, her flashlight bouncing in her hand as the world blurred around her. Behind her, Sarah let out a strangled cry, her voice rising in sheer panic. Linda turned her head just in time to see Sarah collapse, clutching her ankle. "Help me!" Sarah screamed, her flashlight spinning wildly on the frozen ground. The shadows seemed to swell around her, closing in like a living entity. Nate hesitated, his fear etched across his face, but Linda didn't stop to think. She turned back and grabbed Sarah's arm, yanking her upright. The girl limped heavily, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure was moving closer now, gliding toward them with unnatural grace. Its glowing red eyes burned brighter, and the whispers grew sharper, more distinct. "Stay, stay." They reached the truck in a flurry of panic, Nate yanking the door open and pulling Sarah into the passenger seat, while Linda threw herself into the back. "Go, go, go!" she shouted, her voice hoarse. Nate didn't need to be told twice. The truck roared to life, and he slammed his foot on the gas. The tires spun wildly on the icy road, before finally catching traction. As they sped away, Linda dared to glance out the rear window. The bridge was barely visible now, shrouded in darkness and swirling mist. Its red eyes glowed like embers, unblinking as if promising they'd meet again. Back at Linda's house, the three of them huddled in the living room, their breaths still uneven. Sarah had wrapped her injured ankle with an old towel, and Nate paced the floor, his hands running through his hair. "What the hell was that thing?" he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "I don't think it's just a ghost," Linda said, her voice trembling. "It feels older, angrier." Sarah nodded, her eyes wide with fear. "It doesn't want us to leave. It wants to trap us there, like it's been trapped." The realization sent a chill down Linda's spine. The figure wasn't just haunting the bridge, it was bound to it, and now it was trying to tether them too. The next morning, Linda woke to find frost creeping across the inside of her bedroom window, even though the heater was running at full blast. She rubbed her arms against the sudden chill and glanced at her phone. There was another text message waiting for her. "You can't escape, come back." She threw the phone across the room, her pulse racing. By midday, she couldn't ignore the signs anymore. The whispers followed her everywhere, soft, insistent murmurs that seemed to come from just behind her. Shadows danced in her peripheral vision, and the air around her grew unnaturally cold. It was clear now. Leaving the bridge hadn't freed them. That evening, Linda gathered Nate and Sarah once more. The three of them sat in her living room, their faces pale and drawn. "We have to go back," Linda said finally. "It's not going to stop until we do." Nate looked at her like she was insane. "Are you hearing yourself? That thing almost killed us last time." "I know," Linda replied, her voice steady despite her fear. "But it's not letting us go. We have to face it together." Sarah shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. "And do what? What if it's just trying to trick us into coming back so it can, I don't know, take us?" Linda hesitated. She didn't have an answer, but deep down, she knew they didn't have a choice. "If we don't go back," she said quietly, "it'll keep following us. And I don't think it'll stop with just whispers." The final journey to the bridge was suffused with dread. The dirt road seemed darker than before, the trees pressing closer, their skeletal branches reaching toward the truck like claws. When they arrived, the bridge loomed ahead of them, its rusted frame silhouetted against the faint glow of the moon. The air was deathly still, and the oppressive silence made Linda's skin crawl. This time, they didn't linger at the edge. Together, they stepped onto the bridge, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The figure appeared almost immediately, materializing out of the shadows as if it had been waiting for them. "You returned," the whispers hissed, their tone laced with satisfaction. Linda stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. "We're here. What do you want from us?" The figure didn't move, but the whispers shifted, their tone dark and mournful. "To remember, to stay, to suffer, as I have suffered." The shadows around it writhed, and for a moment, Linda thought she saw faces in the darkness, twisted, anguished expressions, mouths open in silent screams. Her heart sank. "You're not the only one here, are you?" she whispered. The figure's glowing eyes flared, and the ground beneath them began to rumble. The rumbling beneath their feet intensified, shaking the rusted bridge like a beast stirring from slumber. Linda gripped the railing for balance, her flashlight trembling in her hand. Around them, the shadows seemed to come alive, coalescing into shapes, faces, and figures, all blurred and twisted, their forms etched with agony. The whispers surged, rising into a cacophony that filled the air with anger and despair. "We are many," the voices hissed, overlapping one another, trapped, forgotten, bound. Nate stumbled backward, his flashlight clattering to the ground. "What do you want from us?" he shouted, his voice breaking. The figure at the center of the bridge stepped forward, its red eyes glowing brighter. The air grew colder, and Linda's breath fogged in front of her as she tried to steady her racing thoughts. "To free us," the voices answered in unison, their tone shifting from anger to a desperate plea, "or join us." Linda's stomach twisted. How do we free you?" The figure tilted its head, its dark form rippling like smoke. "You must give what was taken." The words hung in the freezing air, heavy with implication. "What does that mean?" Sarah whispered, her voice shaking. The whispers didn't answer immediately. Instead, the shadows around them thickened, pressing closer, until they could barely see beyond the narrow circle of their flashlights. And then Linda saw it. At the figure's feet, just barely visible in the dim light, was something that looked like a small, childlike form curled into itself. Its features were indistinct, but its presence radiated an unbearable sadness. Linda's heart clenched as realization dawned. "This isn't just a haunting," she murmured. "This is a grave." The figure seemed to react to her words, its form flickering like a flame caught in the wind. The whispers grew louder, overlapping into an anguished wail. "We were forgotten, left behind. We cannot rest." Linda turned to Nate and Sarah, her voice urgent. "We have to acknowledge them. Remember them. That's what they've been asking for this whole time. Nate's face was pale, his hands trembling, but he nodded. Okay. What do we do? Linda took a deep breath, steadying herself. We tell their story. We make sure they're not forgotten anymore. She turned back to the figure, her voice firm despite the fear gripping her chest. We'll tell the world what happened here. We'll make sure you're remembered. The figure didn't respond, but the shadows around it seemed to hesitate, their movements slowing. Is that enough? Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. The whispers swirled around them, softer now, almost mournful. One must stay. Linda's blood ran cold. The words echoed in her mind, heavy with finality. What do you mean? She asked, though she already knew the answer. The figure raised an arm, pointing directly at her. One must carry the weight, bear the burden, stay or we remain bound. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. The spirits weren't just asking to be remembered, they needed someone to take their place, to tether the restless souls to the living world. No, Sarah whispered, shaking her head. There has to be another way. The whispers rose again, more insistent this time. One must stay. One must stay. One must stay. Linda's mind raced. Her instinct was to run, to escape this nightmare, but she couldn't ignore the overwhelming despair radiating from the spirits. They had suffered for so long, trapped in this liminal space, forgotten and ignored. I'll stay, Nate said suddenly, his voice breaking. Linda whipped around, her eyes wide. No, you can't. I have to, he interrupted, his jaw set despite the fear in his eyes. This started because of me. I was the one who wanted to come here. If someone has to stay, it should be me. The figure turned its glowing eyes toward Nate, its form still and silent. Before Linda could protest, Nate stepped forward, his movements shaky but determined. As he approached the figure, the shadows seemed to recede slightly, giving way to a faint, ghostly light that illuminated the bridge. If this will end it, Nate said, his voice steady now, then I'm ready. The figure reached out, its shadowy hand hovering inches from Nate's chest. The whispers fell silent, and for a moment, the only sound was the faint rustling of the wind. Then, with a sudden burst of light, the figure dissolved, its form scattering into the air like ashes. The shadows around them vanished, and the oppressive weight that had filled the air lifted. Linda and Sarah watched in stunned silence as Nate turned to face them, his expression unreadable. It's done, he said quietly. They left the bridge that night, the air around them eerily calm. For the first time in days, there were no whispers, no shadows lurking at the edges of their vision. But Linda couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Nate was quiet on the drive back, his eyes distant, as though part of him had been left behind on the bridge. The next morning, Linda returned to the bridge alone. She stood at the edge, staring out at the rusted structure and the frozen river below. The air was still and quiet, the spirits finally at peace. But as she turned to leave, she thought she heard a faint whisper carried on the wind. Thank you. And just beneath it, almost too quiet to hear, don't forget me. Linda didn't look back. She walked away, the weight of the night still heavy on her shoulders, knowing she would never truly forget what had happened on that forgotten bridge.